Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. And this a new series documenting the crimes of individuals who have been residents of Wakefield Prison, otherwise known as Monster Mansion, due to its reputation for housing some of Britain's most brutal and notorious criminals. But before I begin this series, I wish to state that while the focus is on the inmates, we must also keep in mind the men and women who work hard within the prison system, having to contend with these inmates on a daily basis, sometimes at great risk to their own physical and mental health, and their dedication should not be forgotten. Nor should the victims whose loved ones continue to endure the pain caused by the individuals held within the prison walls. For this series, either one or more episodes will focus on a specific inmate, delving into the life and crimes of some of the most dangerous individuals ever to walk the streets of Britain, with the common connection being that each served time behind the walls of Wakefield Prison. Join me for this instalment in which I explore the history of the prison, what life behind its walls was like, and delve into the crimes of some of its long-forgotten inmates. Westgate in Wakefield is one of the main roads into the city, a route known to weekend revellers as the Westgate Run, due to the abundance of drinking establishments that sit alongside the road, with the necessary takeaways conveniently located to quell the early morning hunger of a night of drinking. To commuters, it is a means of getting to and from work, with the road either leading directly into the heart of the city, which is occupied by shops, estate agents and law firms, while in the opposite direction the road connects with the A638 Dewsbury Road and on to junction 40 of the M1, a major motorway connecting Leeds in the north to London in the south. Heading west towards the city, Westgate passes below the railway line of the train station that bears its name, recently refurbished, with the main station building being relocated. It sits on the East Coast Main Line, which, like the M1, offers crucial transport links between the northern cities and London. After the railway bridge, the road traverses up an incline towards the main shopping precinct and the Bull Ring, once the site of cattle markets, when the city was one of the largest and most affluent metropolises in Yorkshire. Amongst the many architecturally beautiful buildings that occupy the city is its 14th century cathedral, which boasts the tallest spire in the county, and until the urbanisation of the area, it enjoyed a prominent position. I myself once worked on a retail park located at the foot of the hill, just before Westgate passes under the railway bridge, and from the car park one can just about make out the yellow stone walls of Wakefield Prison, although it barely crossed my mind as I went about my daily life. And it made me wonder how many other people, travelling around the city by road, train, or on a drunken night out, pondered who dwelt behind its high walls, which are barely noticeable as they sit behind once grand buildings, which are now in varying states of disrepair. The prison's official address is Love Lane, which sounds like it should be a picturesque and romantic street, with quaint little cottages, whose gardens are filled with roses and wildflowers, where bees flit and birds sing softly. Yet the reality is quite different. Love Lane feeds off roads occupied by a brewery and other industrial units. With the East Coast Main Line on the right-hand side, it is a long, almost soulless street, occupied on the right-hand side by car parks, and a grand-looking building which is used as an initial accommodation centre for those seeking asylum in the UK. Beyond this, the road reaches a dead end at the rear of the now-defunct Bezier printing plant. Beside this is a small pedestrian passageway, and on the opposite side of this path stands a series of new-build houses, whose gable ends face towards the imposing yellow stone walls of the prison. The prison site itself is over 2,300 feet in length and 701 feet wide and can house up to 750 inmates. While the perimeter walls are built of yellow stone, the internal buildings are predominantly constructed of red brick, with the main structure dating back to the Victorian era, yet the history of the prison goes back further than the 19th century. The original site upon which HMP Wakefield stands was once the location of the Wakefield Correction House, which began construction round about 1595, having been funded by barrister George Saville upon his death. George came from a prominent family in Wakefield. They were notable for their wealth and influence, and are named as one of the founders of the exclusive Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, which was granted royal authority by Elizabeth I herself to carry her name. The school has an illustrious list of former pupils, including Richard Henry Lee, who undertook the journey of over 3,500 miles from Virginia in America to the town of Wakefield at just 16 years old to complete his education at the elite school. He would go on to become one of the founding fathers of the United States, his signature forever immortalized on the Declaration of Independence. Over the years, it has also seen great mathematicians, politicians, authors and architects pass through its halls. Yet it also had some of the most infamous criminals in UK history too, including John George Hay, the acid bath killer, and Stephen Griffith, who became known as the Crossbar Cannibal, who would be given a life sentence which he is currently serving in Wakefield Prison. As well as his family funding the elite school, George Saville left in his will the sum of £20, roughly £6,000 in today's money, to be used in the construction of the Wakefield Corrections House. According to an article in the Wakefield Free Press from June 1895, the first incarnation of the prison was likely prompted by Elizabeth I, Justice of the Peace Act, in which, under conditions 4 and 5, the Justice of the Peace, usually a man of high birth and knowledgeable in the law, was expected to provide houses of corrections in the districts within their jurisdiction. It is believed that Wakefield's first house of correction was completed in 1597, although there are few details regarding it. The Free Press article refers to Whitaker's Lodis et Elmet, which translates to History of Leeds, in which there is a mention of an inmate called Walter Calverley, who was in the House of Corrections in 1604, and was likely one of the prison's first occupants, and a Maester Key, who may have been one of the first governors. In the book, we are provided an insight into what life was like at the time, with it stating that Walter Calverley was, quote, committed to one Maester Key's house, for at this time the infection of the plague was violent in York. The plague mentioned was known as the Great Visitation, which had started in London in 1603 and spread throughout the country, with it hitting the city of York in 1604 with particular ferocity, claiming the lives of 1 in 3 of the population. However, it would be at York that Walter Calverley would meet his end. Whitaker's book was published in 1816, yet there is a more contemporary source published in 1608 in the form of a play called A Yorkshire Tragedy, which provides an insight into what led to Walter being held at Wakefield Jail for the second time. Walter Calverley was the son and heir to a wealthy Yorkshire landowner, whose estate, located between the cities of Bradford and Leeds, bore the family name. As the eldest son, Walter was forced to place duty over love, forsaking a woman he wanted to marry, the daughter of a neighbouring estate owner, in order to be bound to Philippa Brooks, whose status and wealth would elevate his own family. Incidentally, Philippa was related to the man who had become Walter's guardian after his father passed away while he was still a child. Walter was far from an ideal husband. He had attended Cambridge University, but left without attaining a degree, leaving his job prospects limited. But with a large inheritance and his wife's substantial dowry, Walter did not seem to care about managing his money, opting to spend his days drinking and gambling, slowly whittling away the family finances. While he may not have been the best husband, Philippa performed her duties as his wife, providing him with 3 sons, William, Walter and Henry, heirs to the Calverley estate, an inheritance their father had put at risk. Not only had he squandered their wealth, but he had amassed debts that could cause him to lose their home and lands, and in 1605 the creditors came calling, with his brother William, who had acted as a surety for the estate, effectively making himself responsible for any debts, being placed in prison. It is believed that on the 23rd of April 1605, Walter was visited by a man who informed him not only of his brother's imprisonment, but also advised that Walter had been declared bankrupt, meaning all his property would be seized. Leaving his visitor to wander the grounds of the estate, Walter excused himself and headed inside the home, where he encountered his eldest son and heir, William. Withdrawing a dagger, he stabbed the child 3 times, before picking up the wounded infant and carrying him into Philippa's bedroom, where she lay asleep, while a nurse was tending to their middle child, Walter Jr. The nurse's screams at the sight of the bleeding boy were answered by Walter violently grabbing hold of the servant and flinging her down the staircase. The commotion woke Philippa, who desperately tried to protect her second son. Yet despite his mother's efforts, the terrified child was stabbed in the heart as she clung to him. Walter then turned his attention on his wife, accusing her of being unfaithful and declaring that the 2 boys were not his. Amidst this barrage of accusations, he stabbed her numerous times before fleeing from the room, and as he raced down the stairs, he stabbed a male servant who had been coming to investigate the disturbance. Once outside, Walter headed to the stables, informed the visitor to go into the house, and then mounted a horse and made tracks towards the home of the wet nurse, who was caring for his youngest son Henry at her home in the nearby village. Fortunately, his murderous rampage was halted by his steed, who cast him from its back, forcing Walter to continue the journey on foot, leading to him being apprehended before he could inflict more harm. However, within his home, 3 bodies now lay, those of the maid he had cast down the stairs to her death, and his 2 sons, both of whom were under the age of 7. The male servant had received a non-fatal injury. Meanwhile, Philippa, although shaken by the ordeal and her clothing bearing the slash mark from the bloody blade, survived, with it being claimed that her undergarments and the wiring of her corset had prevented the knife from penetrating her skin. It is likely the account of Walter's stay in Wakefield Prison referred to by the Whitaker's text was in relation to his imprisonment in 1604 for debts he had accrued. Yet Walter would return to the House of Corrections in 1605 while he awaited his murder trial in York. Perhaps having come to his senses since the murders, Walter refused to enter any plea to avoid forfeiting his land and titles. By doing so, these would pass to his surviving son Henry. His refusal was seen as an act of defiance, and he was ordered to endure the punishment of pressing. This can only be described as a form of torture. Pressing involved the placement of a piece of wood upon an individual's chest, which would then be loaded with stones one at a time. The supposed intention was to induce the prisoner to either confess or deny their crime. Yet Walter Calverley remained steadfast as the weight compressed on his chest. Restricting his breathing, he refused to plead, and was slowly and painfully crushed to death. Wakefield House of Corrections was originally intended as a place to hold criminals, like Walter Calverley, primarily while they awaited sentencing, or were serving sentences of less than 2 years. The conditions for those who stayed there was a form of punishment in itself, with filthy cells where disease and malnutrition was rife. All inmates, both male and female, were housed together, living in squalid conditions. Their clothes and bodies were soiled, and despite many of them being held awaiting trial, they were made to wear iron shackles about their ankles for the duration of their stay. To add to their hardship, they were expected to pay a fee to the jailer, as if they were staying in a hotel. This fee would be abolished in 1773. In 1764, The site would see its first major change in its 167-year history. While it had seen minor amendments, various prisoner escapes, deteriorating conditions, and overcrowding would bring about the requirement for an improved facility, for which the architect, John Carr, would be called upon to oversee the design and construction. While this new structure would be sufficient for a number of years, the cessation of transportation to America due to the country declaring independence resulted in an influx of inmates being incarcerated in increasingly overcrowded facilities. This led to Wakefield, like many other institutions in Britain, facing the same issues that had plagued its predecessors, namely that the inhabitants were being confined in overcrowded, dirty and damp conditions, allowing disease to spread. As the 1800s began, new buildings would appear, including an infirmary and bathhouse where the prisoners were washed, given clean clothes, and received medical attention. To ease the issue of overcrowding, 193 cells were added. A home for the governor was constructed, although this privilege was not extended to the other staff, who had once dwelt within the grounds, but the expansion had led to an increased number of employees, forcing the decision to allow them to live outside the prison walls. Exercise and work was utilised to give a sense of routine for the inmates. An exercise yard was made available, and a new type of labour was introduced in the form of a tread wheel, with prisoners expected to walk on the wheel for hours at a time, with only exhaustion being the reward for their efforts. Having tended to the mind and bodies of inmates, the prison would also aim to provide for their souls through the construction of a new chapel. It would be during the reign of Queen Victoria that most of the buildings that exist today were created. The Victorians strongly believed that prisons should be places where individuals could be reformed into law-abiding members of society, while also providing a secure yet clean environment where they could be detained during their rehabilitation. As such, in 1847, after 4 years of construction, the new Wakefield Prison emerged, with many of the existing structures being demolished. The new building would have the now characteristic design, which consists of a central hub from which individual prison wings extended. In Wakefield's case, the wings form a semicircle around the central tower. This central tower allowed guards to observe all the wings of the prison from a single point, which proved to be an efficient way to manage the population. Each of the 4 wings stands 4 stories in height, and in total they contain 732 cells. Unlike its previous overcrowded incarnations, it was intended that there would be just 1 prisoner per cell, and the rooms were sparsely furnished with a hammock, a small table, a stool, and a gas lamp. Other changes would also come with the introduction of fortnightly hot baths, a basic education, and the freedom for any inmate to continue practicing their trades, such as carpentry or weaving, while serving their sentences. Changes would also come about regarding the segregation of prisoners, with juvenile inmates who up until 1854 had been kept in solitary confinement, allegedly to protect them from the older and often more hardened criminals. However, it was found that the small isolation cells had a detrimental physical effect on the youngsters, who were not permitted to leave them, causing muscle wastage alongside other signs of mental and physical strain. As such, changes were made to allow juvenile inmates more freedom. They were taken from their cramped cells and placed on a wing of the prison, from where they were allowed to move around freely and use the yard for exercise. They too would benefit from an education and were put to work, learning new skills ready for when they left the facility. At the time, the prison was a mixed-gender facility, meaning men and women were placed together. Gradually, female convicts would be placed on a designated wing, and would only see men when they were in the exercise yard. While inmates' conditions were improving, the staff were not paid well, and a new way to pay their wages and fund the prison was sought. While some prisons continued with the breaking of stone and other forms of hard labour, others embraced the advances of the Industrial Revolution. In 1864, 38 years before it be abolished, the new governor of Wakefield ordered the removal of the treadwheel. Believing it served little purpose, it was replaced with mat-making machines, at which prisoners would work for several hours per day, often without a break, with the mats that they produced providing money for the prison. As one of Britain's largest prisons, Wakefield had a vast pool of individuals who could provide free labour by manning the machines, producing mats on an industrial scale. It wasn't long before the practice of using inmates as free labour was objected to by those within the same industry, who believed the prison had an unfair monopoly on the market. These complaints by influential businessmen, more concerned with losing money than the plight of the inmates, were raised in Parliament, and in 1877 a new Act was introduced, which brought all prisons under the control of the government, while also forbidding the use of prisoners for financial gain. With these changes came the stipulation that men and women should be segregated completely. In Wakefield they had been placed in separate cell blocks, but still shared an exercise yard. However, this would change with the construction of a brand new cell block solely for the women, with its own exercise yard, where legend has it that at the centre of the yard a tree grew, around which the women would take their daily walk. This apparently led to the nursery rhyme, "Here we go round the mulberry bush." The women's cell block would also contain a maternity unit, where they could give birth and live with their baby, as long as they intended to breastfeed. It is believed that children up to the age of 5 lived alongside their mothers, and when the little ones accompanied them into the exercise yard, the now famous nursery rhyme was sung to entertain the children. All these changes led to what was believed to be one of the largest prisons in Europe, a site which would be lauded for being ahead of its time in its design, management and overall treatment of the inmates. During its history, the prison was primarily viewed as a place of reform, with the majority of the inmates being sentenced to serve terms of less than 2 years, while others were awaiting trial or had pending executions at either Armley Jail in Leeds or York Prison. However, for a brief period, between 1906 and 1914, Wakefield would witness the hangings of 10 men, whose deplorable crimes are as heinous as those committed by the current residents, yet their deeds have been forgotten. On the 10th of April 1906, Wakefield would witness one of its first executions, carried out by Henry and Thomas Pierpoint, the father and uncle of one of the last hangmen, Albert. The condemned man was Harold Walters, a 38-year-old miner from Sheffield, who had been convicted of murdering his partner, Sarah Ann McConnell, in December 1905. She had been beaten with a bottle and violated with a broom handle. His crime was discovered when Sarah's landlady entered the room and found Walters kneeling beside his deceased partner. At his trial, it was alleged that he had threatened to kill Sarah on the morning of the murder because she owed him money. The Pierpoints would return to the prison 4 months later to oversee the hanging of 25-year-old Thomas Aiken Monster from Middlesbrough. He had already been charged with acts of bestiality, but the crime that had led to the news occurred in May 1906, when in a fit of jealous rage he strangled his girlfriend Elizabeth Baldwin, an act he would claim was accidental. However, the jury saw it as murder, and he was sent to the gallows. His fate would be shared by another man, whose jealousy drove him to murder. 24-year-old Ernest Hutchinson had been residing with Hannah Marie Whitley and her 5-year-old daughter. Neighbours had noticed that Ernest was often abusive towards Hannah. He had sometimes beaten her, and on one occasion had bit her cheek. His main trigger was a belief that his girlfriend was being unfaithful, and on Christmas Eve 1908, his jealousy proved fatal, when he stabbed the 29-year-old Hannah to death. Following morning, neighbours observed blood pooling from under the door of the couple's room, and upon entering they found the deceased body of Hannah, while Hutchinson sat close by with a self-inflicted wound. I could not find mention of Hannah's daughter, which leads me to assume that the infant was physically unharmed. At his trial, Hutchinson was found guilty. The jury recommended leniency, which was not granted, with him being hanged on the 2nd of March 1909. Following Hutchinson's death, 2 men from Middlesbrough would be brought to Wakefield for execution, the first being Walter Davis in July 1909, who had murdered Hester Richards, a woman with whom he was having an affair. David was followed 3 years later by William Wallace Galbraith, a man with a history of alcoholism, whose 20-year-old wife Mary was 4 months pregnant and had told friends that she was terrified of him. Her fears would be manifested in August 1912, when her husband slit her throat in an act which he had predicted to patrons at the local pub by declaring that there would be, quote, the bloodiest headlines in the papers next day. A month after Galbraith was hanged, Thomas Pierpont would be summoned to carry out the execution of Walter Sykes, whose crime was especially deplorable, as it involved the murder of 2 girls, 10-year-old Amy Nicholson and her cousin Frances Nicholson, aged 7. The 2 children had been seen talking to Sykes a week before their deaths, and on the night of November 15th, 1912, he approached them again as they walked home from a concert rehearsal in their village of Kimberworth, near Rotherham. Luring them to a secluded spot, he sexually assaulted the 10-year-old Amy and then cut both the girls' throats, disposing of their bodies in a hedge, where they were discovered by one of their mothers the following morning. Sykes's downfall came after he had boasted about his crimes to another man, with him proudly stating that the police couldn't catch him. Yet the man he confided in was so disgusted by his actions and immediately informed the authorities, leading to Sykes being executed on the 23rd of April 1913. The final 4 men to be put to death at Wakefield had all been responsible for the deaths of female acquaintances. George Frederick Law, who went to the gallows on December 31st, 1913, had strangled his landlady, Annie Cotterell, after she had evicted him from her home in Sheffield. Walter Marriott would arrive at the prison convicted of killing his wife Nellie after she threw a bottle at him during an altercation. In retaliation, he stabbed her. The single but fatal wound penetrated 7.5 inches into her chest. He would hang for his crime on the 10th of August 1915. Harry Thompson followed him to the gallows in December the same year, having been found guilty of cutting the throat of Alice Kay, a married woman with whom he was having an affair. One of the last men to be executed within the prison walls was John McCartney, an army cook who had entered into a bigamist marriage with Charlotte Kent, who resided in York. Despite being married to more than one woman, both of whom were unaware of the other, John expected his wives to be faithful to him. A violent and jealous man, John would accuse Charlotte of having affairs with soldiers on the army base, and one night his rage turned deadly when he slit her throat with a razor before turning the blade on himself. She died from her wound, while he would survive only to be sentenced to death by hanging. Despite this brief history of capital punishment, the prison was still regarded primarily as a facility for those who had committed minor offences, who would be held for relatively short sentences. However, during the First World War, it would house a different kind of criminal, the conscientious objector. At the outbreak of the Great War, men willingly signed up to fight. However, as the conflict laboured on and the need for troops increased, the government introduced mandatory national service for all single men between the ages of 18 to 41. Yet some still refused to fight, citing ill health, whilst others argued that their political, religious or moral beliefs prevented them from serving. Fearing that more people would seek to avoid being called up, the government formed tribunals at which anyone who refused to fight would have to argue their case. At the hearing, the individual would learn whether they had to serve or not, and those who were found fit to fight, but continued to refuse to do so, would be seen as a conscientious objector, which had been deemed a criminal offence for which the individual may be ordered to serve the country in a non-combative capacity, or if they were imprisoned. The Dice Work Camp had been established in August 1916 near Aberdeen, Scotland. a hastily put together site where objectors had been sent to carry out hard labour, working 10 hours a day quarrying rocks to aid in the war effort. However, the conditions of the camp were brutal. The shelters provided were inadequate, exposing the men to the elements. The facilities offered little sanitation, and men began to fall ill, made worse by exhaustion and pneumonia, resulting in some passing away. After an outcry from local residents and the press, an investigation was launched, and the decision was made to close the camp in October 1916. They moved the prisoners to other sites, with some being placed within Wakefield Prison. There were, however, various factions within the ranks of the objectors, those who were willing to comply with the regulations placed upon them and contributed to the war effort, while others, who would be known as absolutists, refused to do anything that could be construed as aiding the war or supporting the government. The absolutists did not want to play any part in the war, be it on the front lines or at home. They argued that they would rather focus on providing their services to the local community in pacifist roles such as teaching. These individuals were dealt with in camps and prisons across the country by being confined to cells, denied visitors, and refused the right to send and receive letters. Yet the government wanted to seek an alternative way of handling them. So in 1918, 120 absolutists were placed in Wakefield Prison, where they were allowed to reside in unlocked cells and granted freedom to roam the prison grounds, as long as they carried out roles such as maintenance work. Just 3 weeks into what was dubbed the Wakefield experiment, the absolutists made their feelings clear by drafting the Wakefield Manifesto, in which they laid out their stance that they would not comply with prison rules and requested to be freed into the community where they could work in positions which conformed to their political and moral beliefs. Their demands were met with swift action. The men were placed into solitary confinement for 3 days, after which they were transported to various prisons and work camps throughout the country, where they were denied all the leniency and freedom which had been offered to them in Wakefield. It would not be until the summer of 1919 that the government recognised the genuine nature of their objections and authorised the release of the absolutists. During the Second World War, the prison operated as normal despite a number of air raids and one very near miss. One of the targets for the German bombers were key transport links, making Wakefield Westgate Station and its many goods sheds vulnerable to attack. Although it is believed that when the bombs were dropped in December 1940, the pilots had overshot their original target of Sheffield. Regardless of the intention, the prison's location next to the lines of Westgate Station was a precarious one, and the reality of such a situation was almost realised when a bomb weighing 1.5 tons fell into the exercise yard, burying itself deep into the earth yet failing to explode. Initially it was believed to be parts of an already exploded device, but upon closer inspection by a bomb disposal team, it was found to be an intact explosive which had failed to detonate, and the painstaking task of removing it was carried out by the Royal Engineers 3 months after it had landed. During this time, the prisoners had been denied access to the yard. Had it exploded, it would be impossible to imagine the carnage it may have caused, and whether some inmates may have taken the opportunity in the chaos to escape. Fortunately, this never came to pass. Yet the prison walls have not always been impervious to a daring inmate wishing to make a bid for freedom. One of the earliest reports of an escape I could find occurred in 1885. The inmate, Charles Firth Williamson, who had been a resident of Hunslet on the outskirts of Leeds, was arrested for stealing a horse. Ordered to serve a 6-month sentence, he found himself in Wakefield Prison. Having been there for just 5 weeks, he had already planned his escape. Williamson had obtained some clothing to change into, and had previously worked on unscrewing the bolts that held a ceiling vent closed, in an area where he was assigned to work. All he needed to do was wait for the opportune moment. Williamson was granted the time he needed on the 9th of August 1883. Having been left unattended during his work duty in one of the reception rooms, he hastily climbed through the vent and into the loft space above, where he changed his outfit. From this location, Williamson was able to loosen and remove some of the roof tiles above him until there was a sufficient hole for him to pass through. He climbed onto the roof and dropped down from the building, making his bid for freedom across the fields. For just over a year and a half, Charles Williamson was a fugitive. That was until the 16th of January 1885, when he was apprehended less than 10 miles away in Dewsbury. 5 years later, in 1890, another man would evade captivity. While caught in the act of committing a burglary, Arthur Williams was arrested in Rochester, where he was held in custody. Yet the Leeds native managed to escape their clutches. While searching for their fugitive, Rochester police learned that over 200 miles away, a prisoner called Robert Hipps had escaped from Wakefield, and the description proved to be a match to their own wanted man, Arthur Williams. Upon his recapture, wardens from Wakefield were dispatched to Rochester, where they confirmed that Arthur Williams was in fact Robert Hipps, who would admit he was using a false identity. During questioning, it was determined that Hipps, having fled from Wakefield Prison, headed south, leaving behind a trail of well-executed burglaries, until he had been caught in the act in Rochester, a crime he admitted he had committed in order to fund his life on the run. He would not be returned to Wakefield, where he is only being held, pending transportation to another facility. Instead, it is likely he served his 7-year term in Maidstone. On October 17, 1906, 20-year-old William Spinks, who had been convicted of stealing money from children, would leave the prison confines, just 6 weeks into his 3-month sentence. Believed to have come from London, it was suspected that Spinks had headed back to the capital. Yet over 2 weeks after his escape, a man called William Jones would be captured roughly 70 miles north of Wakefield in Darlington. Jones had been charged with the theft of some field glasses from a hotel and was held in Durham jail, where his fingerprints had been taken, and when these were checked, it was discovered that the man in the cells was in fact William Spinks. In January 1932, the Dundee Evening Telegraph would report on the escape of 3 men from the prison grounds. Yet the trio's escape would be one of a number of attempts made that year from the facility, which the newspaper had stated was one designed to effect some measure of reform, with, quote, "a good deal of liberty inside the prison is accorded to the men, and they are encouraged to participate in sports. They have also educational classes and concerts, access to the prison library, and routine in the prison is much less severe than it was in pre-war days." The 3 men mentioned in the report had attempted to escape, having scaled the walls during an exercise session while the wardens were distracted. Their flight was discovered immediately, and the guards pursued the men, one of whom was caught shortly after he had fled. The other 2, Thomas Alfred Taylor and Harry Marsh, were briefly halted by a warden, who was found by his colleagues, having been attacked and rendered unconscious. Having incapacitated the guard, the 2 men made their escape, but the following morning they were witnessed by P.C. Lawrence in the nearby town of Ossett. The officer had been on patrol when his attention was drawn to the sound of breaking glass from a billiard hall. Heading inside the building to investigate, P.C. Lawrence encountered the 2 men. Amidst a violent struggle, the officer was able to detain Thomas Taylor, who would be returned to Wakefield. Harry Marsh fled the scene, although he would be captured 3 days later in Leeds. A Scotsman newspaper would report on a further escape in March of 1932, with the article adding to the Dundee Evening Telegraph's description of the regime found at the prison, describing it as being a place which, quote, "for some time now ideas have been embodied in the treatment of the men. All the prisoners are serving sentences of 6 months or longer, and are divided into 3 communities. Each community has its privileges, which are given to the men as a body and not as individuals. The privileges are liable to be forfeited if abused by any one member. One privilege is exemption from research on going from the workshop to the cell. Another is the playing of football on Saturday. The different communities play for the prison championship and the prison cup. While these practices were designed to promote a sense of community and healthy competition, some inmates would demonstrate little regard for this regime by taking advantage of the freedoms they were offered. At the time of his arrest, 25-year-old Fred Barr from Hull was wanted for housebreaking and larceny. During a search for him, the police turned up at his home in the city and found 4 children lying on a bed. However, concealed beneath the infants, the officers found Fred. He was arrested and ordered to serve a 12-month sentence at Wakefield Prison, from where he and a second man would escape. Unlike his fellow fugitive, Fred would be apprehended in nearby Dewsbury within 24 hours. The other escapee was Mancunian William Frederick Rimmer, who was serving a 21-month sentence for larceny. He had been with Fred when the police caught up to them in Dewsbury. Rimmer had actually been handcuffed to the railings of a chapel while the lone constable chased after Fred, who was captured, and when the officer returned to the chapel railings, he discovered that Rimmer had managed to slip his wrist from the handcuffs and disappear. His break for freedom would be brief, as William Rimmer would be apprehended a short time later in Dridlington, which sits between Leeds and Bradford. Both men would be returned to Wakefield Prison to resume their sentences. It would be revealed in 1959 that the prison security had been breached 31 times since the end of the Second World War. Amongst these breaches was the escape of Robert Harrington Sanders, a man serving a 14-year sentence for attempted murder after shooting a police officer. It was also revealed at his trial in June 1945 that while stationed in Germany during the Second World War, he had been sentenced by court-martial to 15 years penal servitude for rape, assault and robbery. This sentence would be reduced to 8 years, yet Sanders had no intention of serving his full term. And just a year into his imprisonment abroad, he managed to find his way back to the UK. Returning to a life of crime, he was arrested in Chingford, Essex, but he managed to escape from the arresting officer by plummeting 30 feet from a viaduct. This bid for freedom was in vain, as he was later caught in Clacton-on-Sea. Upon his sentencing for the attempted murder of a police officer, the judge ordered that his 14 years should be served concurrently with the remaining 7 years of his court-martial term. Despite the severity of his crimes, over the years of his incarceration within Wakefield, Sanders had managed to garner the trust of the prison wardens, portraying himself as a model prisoner, and as such, he was allowed to carry out the task of stalking the boilers. In performing this duty, Sanders was granted permission to traverse the prison yard unattended, and one night he turned this weakness in the prison security to his advantage. On December 13, 1952, he found a way to scale the walls using a self-made grappling hook and electrical wire, with his absence being noted 10 minutes later. Sanders' escape became the focus of many news stories, with him being dubbed Scarface on account of a distinctive injury that would have made him stand out in public. The press warned that he was a dangerous individual who should not be approached. People began to contact the police with sightings of the wanted man, but soon the focus fell on the City of London, where Sanders had lived prior to his imprisonment. It was in the East End of the capital that he would be apprehended, but he had been busy during his months of freedom, with Sanders forming his own gang, with whom he had planned to continue his criminal career. Upon Sanders being returned to prison, concerns began to be raised regarding how secure the facility was, especially because of the risk inmates like Sanders posed to the public. These fears would be added to by the end of the 1950s, with the IRA making several attempts to free their incarcerated members. An attempt in 1956 was aborted when the alarms were triggered, but another bid by the IRA in 1959 involving Seamus Murphy would prove successful. Imprisoned 4 years earlier for a raid on an army depot, Seamus, otherwise known as James, was aided in his escape by 4 accomplices, 2 of whom acted as decoys, while the others threw a rope over the prison walls to allow him to climb to freedom. Over the ensuing weeks, Seamus was moved from various flats, and while being housed in Manchester, an interview was given by his sister in which she stated he had returned to Ireland, with another article in which a journalist reported that they had interviewed the escapee, who was holed up in a remote farmhouse in his native country. With the authorities' attentions focused on Ireland, Seamus left Manchester and headed to Scotland, from where he travelled to Ireland once the search for him was scaled back. He would not be recaptured, making Seamus the only man to successfully escape from Wakefield Prison. The number of prison breaks, not just at Wakefield but many others in the country, led to serious questions being raised regarding the effectiveness of security procedures and whether they were sufficient in keeping inmates contained and maintaining public safety. However, it was the escape of George Blake which prompted an investigation that became known as the Prison Escape and Security Inquiry. During a House of Commons session held on the 24th of October 1966, Mr. Roy Jenkins, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, declared that, quote, "At 7 p.m. on Saturday the 22nd of October, George Blake was found to be missing from Wormwood Scrubs Prison. The circumstances are still under investigation, but my present information is that he made his escape from the prison wing through a landing window, a bar of which had been broken. He escaped over the outside wall of the prison with the aid of a ladder, which appears to have been supplied from outside." Blake's escape, 5 years into his 42-year sentence, was a matter of great concern. According to the Deputy Governor of Wormwood Scrubs, he was a man who, quote, "must always be under the closest supervision. He is a security risk in every sense of the word." Although there had been high-profile escapes before Blake, in the eyes of the government he was seen as the greatest threat, as he was deemed to pose a risk to national security, given that George Blake was imprisoned for disclosing highly confidential information to Russia while working at MI6 during the Cold War. He betrayed hundreds of operatives in the process by disclosing their identities, leading to the deaths of many, with him becoming known as the betrayer of the West. Blake's escape came at a time when Secretary of State Roy Jenkins was already facing backlash for his attitude towards the judicial system. He had been pressed to reinstate capital punishment, especially in the light of the capture of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, but he declined to give in to public pressure. He was also viewed as being too lenient, in that he removed corporal punishment from prisons, and under his tenure there had been 21 high-profile prison breaks, including the escape of 2 of the great train robbers, Charlie Wilson and Ronnie Biggs, and 6 prisoners from the same Wormwood Scrubs wing from which George Blake had made his escape. In the light of such events, compounded by the escape of George Blake, Roy Jenkins announced during the same House of Commons session that a full investigation would be launched, not only regarding Blake's escape, but an independent inquiry into prison security in general, to be carried out by Lord Mountbatten. Although Blake's escape was initially believed to have been aided by foreign operatives, it would emerge that he had been assisted by current and former inmates who had sympathised with his plight, and worked together to get him out of the prison, from where he was escorted through Europe and into the hands of his Russian handler, who took Blake to the Soviet Union, where he resided until his death in 2020 at the age of 98. Much of this information regarding Blake's escape would not have been known to those conducting the Mountbatten inquiry in 1966. However, their review into prison security would lead to over 50 recommendations that would shape the prison system we have today. Having started life as a house of corrections, where individuals both male and female were detained, either while on remand or serving short sentences, Wakefield became a male-only facility in 1914. And while there were many changes made over the years, the main Victorian buildings remained, and in the 1970s, following the Mountbatten report, Wakefield Prison would evolve into the facility that now exists. Sweeping changes were made, including new security measures such as electric door locks and floodlights in the yard, which allowed wardens better visibility. While these amendments were introduced to improve security, another change was brought in to ensure that those who posed the most risk were kept in the most suitable location. This was done by categorization, effectively labelling a prisoner based on the severity of their crimes and allocating them to an institution which would provide the best level of security, with low-risk prisoners being granted more freedoms than those deemed of a greater threat. There are 4 risk levels, ranging from Category D, or what is referred to as an open prison, designated to those individuals who pose little to no risk to the public and are believed to be unlikely to escape. These prisons are sometimes the last step before an individual is fully released from the prison system having served their sentence. Category C prisons house those who, quote, lack the resource and will to make escape attempts, but have not the stability to be kept in conditions where there are no barriers to escape. At Wakefield Prison, some of the wings are reserved primarily for Category B prisoners, individuals who require a more secure environment. These prisoners may be serving longer sentences, but have the prospect of being released, and make up roughly 70% of Wakefield Prison's population. In 1967, Wakefield Prison, HMP Belmarsh in London, HMP Frankland in County Durham, and Long Marton Prison in Worcestershire, alongside a handful of others, were designated as high-security prisons, housing inmates classified as Category A prisoners. And these individuals may be moved between these facilities on a regular basis for a multitude of reasons, as will become apparent over the next few episodes. Category A prisoners make up roughly 30% of Wakefield's population, and are those who, quote, must in no circumstances be allowed to get out, either because of the security considerations affecting spies, or because their violent behaviour is such that members of the public or the police would be in danger of their lives if they were to get out. The majority of these inmates, many of whom will be discussed during the course of this series, are known as lifers, with the chances of them leaving the prison system being highly unlikely due to the crimes they have committed and the risk they pose should they be set free. Those who pose the greatest danger are kept in the prison F wing, which itself is divided into 2 separate units, one which contains 8 cells, often for those who require close supervision. The maximum time an individual may spend in this unit is just over 3 years, and in that time they are provided with therapy and education, with the aim being that they can reintegrate back into the general prison population. While the close supervision unit is intended in aiding reintegration, the second unit in F wing is designed to separate. The isolation block is used to house inmates in solitary confinement. Those placed within one of its 21 cells are kept confined for up to 23 hours a day, with the 24th being allotted to an hour's exercise in the yard, yet even this is a privilege that in the past was taken away dependent on behaviour. Being confined to a small cell with limited daylight and restricted social interactions can have a detrimental impact on a person's physical and mental well-being. As such, the use of isolation is meant to be limited to a maximum of 2 weeks at a time. Yet there are some extreme and notable cases which defy this stipulation, one of whom I shall cover over the next 4 episodes. Charles Bronson has suffered the ill effects of solitary confinement and has experienced the brutal reality of being institutionalised. Originally imprisoned in the 1970s, he has stayed in over 120 prisons in the country, and all 3 high-security psychiatric hospitals, with him still being behind bars today. Join me next time as I delve into Charles Bronson's life and crimes, and his experiences in some of the most secure facilities in the country. Discover why a man who was sentenced to 7 years for armed robbery in the 1970s is still incarcerated today, when so many others who committed similar or worse offences have been freed.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.